Imagine you're standing at the edge of this vast, incredibly complex landscape.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And this terrain is public health. It encompasses the physical well-being, the latent genetic risks, environmental hazards, behavioral patterns of millions of individuals. And your specific mission is to map the architecture of this terrain.
Which is an overwhelming task, really.
Completely.
Yeah.
To do it, you basically have two primary tools to pierce that sheer scale. The first tool is a high-resolution wide-angle flash camera. You hold it up to the landscape, the flash goes off, and for a single frozen instant in time, everything is brilliantly illuminated.
Right, you capture a perfect representation of the population exactly as it exists in that one specific moment.
Exactly. But the second tool is entirely different. It's an active, early warning radar system. It's constantly sweeping the terrain, sending out signals, searching for hidden anomalies, looking for tiny blips on the screen before they ever develop into visible threats.
I love that dual metaphor. It perfectly captures the operational difference between the two massive public health frameworks we're unpacking today.
Yeah, the camera and the radar.
Right. That high-resolution camera represents cross-sectional studies. The entire methodology is built around capturing the prevalence of disease and the exposure to risk factors simultaneously. It gives us the landscape today.
Just a frozen snapshot.
Exactly. And on the other hand, that radar system sweeping the terrain represents population screening, the active, systematic attempt to identify pre-disease states in populations that presume themselves to be entirely healthy. We're looking at the foundational architecture of how we gather data and then how we choose to intervene.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're setting the parameters for today's deep dive. This conversation is designed specifically for you. Whether you're a medical student grinding through your epidemiology blocks, a junior doctor trying to figure out why national guidelines dictate your daily practice, or a public health trainee locking down your system's thinking.
We are building clear, robust conceptual frameworks here.
We really are. We're going to strictly differentiate vital concepts that are honestly, notoriously easy to conflate on the wards. Concepts like incidence versus prevalence, and the critical difference between opportunistic case finding and true population surveillance.
And the overarching theme we're maintaining throughout this entire exploration is the why behind the numbers. We aren't just cataloging statistical definitions.
No, nobody wants a textbook read to them.
Right, we're exploring the reasoning. We want to understand the mechanisms behind how a cross-sectional study is physically constructed, why population data can create these powerful optical illusions that trick even seasoned researchers, and ultimately, why massive billion-dollar screening programs are launched.
And why they occasionally have to be forcefully shut down, which is fascinating. This deep dive functions as your active companion guide to the foundational concepts in the Oxford textbook of global public health, specifically the chapters on cross-sectional studies and screening. You should be reading those primary sources alongside this discussion.
It's the structural spine of our chat today.
Yeah. And why should you care? Because whether you are a clinician diagnosing a single patient in an exam room, or a policymaker evaluating a national health budget, understanding how epidemiological data is gathered and how easily it can deceive us is the bedrock of modern medicine. If you don't understand how the camera works, you cannot trust the photograph.
It's a great way to put it. So let's begin with that camera. Let's structure the snapshot.
Let's do it. What are the defining parameters of a cross-sectional study?
Well, the defining feature, which you'll frequently see referred to in the clinical literature as a prevalence study or a disease frequency study, is its temporal relationship. It measures exposure and outcome at the exact same point in time.
Meaning there's no time travel.
Right. You are not following a cohort of healthy people forward for 20 years to see who develops a disease, and you aren't taking a group of sick patients and looking backward through their medical history to find an exposure like in a case control design.
You're just asking what is true right now.
Yeah, exactly. And because you are only capturing that single point in time, the primary, most powerful utility of this design is measuring the prevalence of a disease, meaning the existing burden of cases. It's inherently not designed to measure incidence.
Which is the rate of new cases actively developing. And, man, that distinction between prevalence and incidence is a trap that catches a lot of clinicians. So we need to lock that conceptual framework in right now.
It's crucial. And within prevalence itself, the literature distinguishes between two subtypes, point prevalence and period prevalence.
How do you differentiate them?
It comes down to how wide you open the shutter on your camera. Point prevalence is a measurement taken on one single specific date. Say you want to know the exact number of individuals in a health district with an active type 2 diabetes diagnosis on June 1st. That's point prevalence.
Just that one day.
Right. Period prevalence stretches that measurement over a defined interval, like tracking anyone who held that diagnosis at any point during a single calendar year.
Okay, but to really understand how these numbers behave in the real world, we have to look at the mathematical engine driving them. There's a specific relationship between prevalence, incidence, and the duration of the disease.
Yes, the textbook defines this mathematically. Prevalence odds equals incidence multiplied by the duration of the disease.
P over 1 minus P equals I times D.
That's the formula.
Let's translate that math into clinical reality, because this equation dictates what you actually see when you walk into a hospital or look at a regional health dashboard. Think about a disease that is highly fatal and progresses rapidly.
Like pancreatic cancer, for example.
Exactly. The duration of the disease is terribly short because the patient passes away so quickly. Even if the incidence, the number of new people developing it every month, is alarmingly high, the overall prevalence in the population is going to remain remarkably low.
Because when the cross-sectional camera flash goes off, it just won't capture many people living with that specific condition. They don't remain in the population pool for very long.
That's the perfect visualization. And the Oxford text uses a really profound comparative example based on oncology data from the U.S. around 2004. They looked at bladder cancer versus lung cancer.
Oh, this is a great example of the illusion.
It really is. If you look strictly at incidence, the rate of new diagnoses, lung cancer, was vastly more common. The incidence rate was 81.2 per 100,000 people. Bladder cancer incidence was less than half of that, at 37.3.
So based on incidence data alone, you'd assume lung cancer is the dominant burden on the healthcare system's daily outpatient capacity.
You would. But when researchers looked at the prevalence, the actual number of people alive and living with the disease at that specific point in time, the numbers flipped entirely.
It completely inverted.
Yeah. There were over 377,000 individuals living with bladder cancer compared to only about 174,000 living with lung cancer.
And they flipped because survival rates govern the duration variable in our equation. Back then, bladder cancer had a 5-year survival rate of nearly 80%. Patients were treated, monitored, and lived with the diagnosis for years, accumulating in the population.
Whereas lung cancer, tragically, had a 5-year survival rate of roughly 15%.
Right, so the duration was minimal. The cross-sectional study illuminates this massive population of bladder cancer survivors, not because the disease strikes more frequently, but simply because the medical system keeps them alive longer.
If you look at prevalence data without understanding the P equals I times D relationship, you will completely misinterpret the actual risk profile and incidence rate of a pathology.
And understanding that existing burden is exactly why these studies are the absolute lifeblood of health service planning. Policymakers don't base hospital bed allocations or specialist training programs just on incidence. They base them on prevalence. They need to know the total volume of care required by the population today.
Which drives the creation of these heavyweights of epidemiological research, the massive national multi-purpose surveys.
They are phenomenal logistical achievement.
The logistics are genuinely staggering. We aren't just talking about mailing out a few questionnaires. The text details the health survey in England, which evaluates roughly 8,000 adults and 2,000 children every single year.
And the U.S. equivalent, NAAES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, is even more intense.
Yeah. NAAES evaluates a nationally representative sample of about 5,000 persons annually. But they actually deploy fleets of mobile examination centers. They're essentially highly specialized clinics on wheels driving across the country.
They are drawing blood, taking saliva samples, performing dual-energy X-ray absorptiometry scans, conducting detailed dietary interviews. It's incredibly thorough.
The power of NAAES and these similar national surveys lies in their continuous, repeated cross-sectional design. They take a new, highly detailed snapshot of a fresh, representative demographic sample year after year.
And by comparing those sequential snapshots, epidemiologists can detect massive societal shifts that would otherwise remain completely invisible to an individual clinician. They track underlying social determinants of health on a macro scale.
Like the childhood obesity data.
Exactly. Researchers used data from NNAs alongside the National Survey of Children's Health between 2003 and 2007, just a 4-year window.
But the demographic drift they uncovered in that brief window was stark.
It was a very clear demonstration of widening socioeconomic health disparities. They analyzed the prevalence of obesity and stratified the data by the educational attainment of the parents.
What did they find?
For children whose parents had fewer than 12 years of education, the prevalence of obesity was hovering around 30% by 2007. But in stark contrast, for children whose parents had graduated from college, the obesity prevalence was only about 10%.
Wow, a threefold difference.
Yeah, and furthermore, by comparing the 2003 snapshot to the 2007 snapshot, they could prove that this disparity was actively widening. The gap between the socioeconomic tiers was growing.
Which is something a single physician in a private practice just cannot see. It requires the immense external validity of a deeply funded, nationally representative survey to prove that a public health crisis is disproportionately accelerating within specific vulnerable demographics.
These representative surveys also have this unique ability to illuminate populations that the traditional medical establishment often overlooks completely.
Right, the invisible workforce. There's a brilliant utilization of NANE's data by Arif and colleagues focusing on occupational asthma. Think about how occupational health is traditionally studied. If you want to know if chemical workers are getting asthma, you design a cohort study. You go to a specific manufacturing plant, enroll the workers, track their lung function over time.
But that methodology contains a massive blind spot.
It completely misses the decentralized informal workforce. It misses people who do not have a centralized human resources department or a corporate occupational health clinic.
Exactly. Because NANAs uses a nationally representative sample of the general population rather than targeting specific workplaces, it captured a highly at-risk, often invisible demographic, domestic cleaners.
These are individuals working in private homes, totally isolated from traditional occupational surveillance.
Right, and by analyzing the cross-sectional data of lung function, reported symptoms, and occupational history, researchers confirmed that domestic cleaning was among the highest risk occupations for work-related asthma.
The data actually suggested those exposures contributed to a massive 26% population attributable risk for the condition overall. The snapshot captured the reality of the invisible workforce.
It really demonstrates the absolute necessity of external validity, but NANEs is restricted to a single nation. What happens when the public health question is global?
How do you take a cross-sectional snapshot of the entire planet?
The logistical, cultural, and linguistic hurdles are almost insurmountable, yet it has been done. The premier example of this global ambition is the International Study of Asthma and Allergies in Childhood, universally known as the ISAC study.
The scale of ISAC Phase 1 is difficult to fully comprehend. They coordinated the evaluation of almost 700,000 children across 56 different countries.
Just massive.
And to make the data comparable, they couldn't just translate a standard English questionnaire into dozens of languages, because the cultural understanding of a word like wheeze varies wildly.
Oh, completely. How do you standardize a symptom description globally?
They had to pioneer standardized video questionnaires, showing visual manifestations of asthma attacks to ensure that a child in rural China and a child in urban New Zealand were reporting the exact same physiological phenomena.
That is brilliant methodology, and the data they generated completely upended the prevailing assumptions about global respiratory health. They found extreme, unexplained variation in the prevalence of current wheeze, which was defined as experiencing symptoms within the past 12 months.
The ranges were huge, right?
Yeah, the prevalence ranged from a global low of 1.8% in certain centers to a staggering high of 36.7% in others. Historically, we saw incredibly high rates in the English-speaking world, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and surprisingly low rates throughout Eastern Europe and China.
In a companion cross-sectional initiative focusing on adults, the European Community Respiratory Health Survey, or ECRHS, found similar geographic patterns. It was really instrumental in linking indoor environmental factors like specific allergens and cat dander to bronchial hyperresponsiveness.
But here we run into the inherent limitation of the basic cross-sectional design. A snapshot is, by definition, frozen.
Yeah, it tells you that the UK has high asthma prevalence and Eastern Europe has low prevalence in that specific year. But it cannot show you movement.
Right. It can't tell you if the rates are converging or diverging.
So to capture that movement without the astronomical expense of a true longitudinal cohort study, where you'd have to track the exact same 700,000 children for 20 years, epidemiologists utilize a hybrid methodology.
They construct what is known as a panel study. Conceptually, a panel study is a series of cross-sectional studies conducted sequentially over a period of time.
And there are a couple of ways to do that, right?
Yes, two primary ways. You can either revisit the exact same individuals and take repeated snapshots of their health, or Much more commonly, in large epidemiological surveillance, you take repeated snapshots of the same population parameter.
Meaning you survey a representative sample of 13-year-olds in a specific city in 1995. Then, 10 years later, you survey a completely new representative sample of 13-year-olds in that exact same city.
Which is exactly the methodology utilized in Isaac Phase 3. They returned to those same global centers 5 to 10 years after the initial Phase I snapshot. And by comparing the 2 points in time, they discovered that the extreme global disparity in asthma prevalence was actually beginning to narrow,
The prevalence was dropping slightly in the historically high-burden English-speaking countries, while simultaneously rising in regions like Latin America and Africa.
suggesting massive ongoing shifts in global environmental or lifestyle exposures.
But panel studies aren't just for evaluating decade-long global trends. They can be scaled way down and tightly controlled to capture acute, real-time physiological changes.
And when they're deployed this way, the methodology really begins to blur the rigid boundary between a purely observational cross-sectional snapshot and an active experimental design.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This brings us to a fascinating, highly focused study by McCreener and colleagues that perfectly illustrates this blurred line. They assembled a panel of 60 adult volunteers, all of whom had a diagnosis of asthma.
Okay.
They instructed these individuals to walk for 2 hours down Oxford Street in London. For context, Oxford Street is a notoriously congested commercial artery, heavily polluted with diesel exhaust from buses and taxis.
Not a great place for an asthmatic to take a stroll.
Not at all. And on a completely separate occasion, they had those exact same 60 adults walk for 2 hours through Hyde Park, which is a massive, heavily wooded, relatively pristine green space away from the traffic.
Because the researchers were taking immediate, highly specific physiological measurements, essentially taking internal snapshots of the subject's lung function and systemic inflammatory markers immediately before, during, and after each walk, they could map the acute physiological toll of the local environment.
And the data was incredibly clear. The Oxford Street exposure induced consistent, measurable drops in forced expiratory volume in 1 second, FEV1, and forced vital capacity, FVC, of up to 6.1% compared to the Hyde Park walk.
So even though it utilizes a cross-sectional panel framework, the study operates functionally like a crossover clinical trial. It definitively demonstrated an immediate detrimental physiological response to a specific real-world environmental exposure.
It is an incredibly elegant use of the methodology. But, and this is the crucial caveat for anyone critically appraising a medical journal article, the cross-sectional design has a fundamental, inescapable flaw.
It's Achilles' heel.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that flaw is temporal ambiguity.
It's the ultimate epidemiological chicken and egg problem. Because you are measuring the exposure to a risk factor and the presence of a disease at the exact same moment in time, you frequently cannot establish the direction of causality.
Did the exposure precede the disease and cause it? Or did the onset of the disease alter the patient's behavior or physiology, thereby causing the exposure?
This phenomenon is formally known as reverse causation.
Let's look at a modern example of this trap using data from the NHA survey regarding the relationship between phthalates and childhood obesity. Phthalates are ubiquitous chemical compounds used to make plastics more durable. They're in countless consumer products.
When researchers looked at the cross-sectional snapshot, a clear statistical correlation emerged. Children who had higher concentrations of urinary phthalate metabolites were significantly more likely to be obese.
It is very tempting to look at that correlation and conclude, okay, phthalate exposure causes metabolic derangement leading to weight gain.
Very tempting. But you have to critically analyze the biological mechanisms involved. Phthalates have an extremely short biological half-life. They are metabolized and excreted in roughly 24 hours. Therefore, the urine sample only reflects the child's chemical exposure over the single day prior to the clinic visit.
So the temporal ambiguity is massive. Does the chemical cause the obesity? Or is it equally plausible that obese children have different behavioral patterns?
Right. Perhaps they consume more highly processed foods packaged in phthalate-heavy plastics.
Or perhaps restricted mobility means they spend more time indoors, exposed to off-gassing from synthetic carpets and furniture. In that scenario, the obesity is actually causing the increase of phthalate exposure, not the other way around.
The cross-sectional camera is completely blind to the direction of the arrow of causality. And this is not a new dilemma in public health. It traces its roots back to the absolute foundations of modern epidemiology.
You're thinking of Jerry Morris.
I am. Jerry Morris's legendary 1950s investigation into the cardiovascular health of London transport workers. Morris compared the bus drivers, who sat sedentary behind the wheel for their entire shift, with the bus conductors, who spent their days actively walking up and down the stairs of the double-decker buses collecting fares.
The cross-sectional data clearly showed that the active conductors had significantly lower rates of coronary heart disease than the sedentary drivers.
And Morris concluded that occupational physical activity protected against cardiovascular disease.
Which we now know to be broadly true. However, at the time, his cross-sectional observation was subjected to intense methodological criticism based on the potential for reverse causation.
Because the critics presented a highly plausible alternative mechanism, self-selection bias. They argued that leaner, inherently healthier, more energetic men naturally self-selected into the physically demanding role of the conductor.
And conversely, men who were genetically predisposed to obesity, lethargy, or early cardiovascular issues naturally gravitated toward the sedentary job of the driver.
If that self-selection occurred, then the job didn't cause the health status. The underlying health status dictated the job.
To prove causality, you have to untangle those competing variables, which cross-sectional studies simply cannot do. But the biases inherent in this design can be far more insidious than simple reverse causation. We have to discuss incidence prevalence bias, which is classically referred to in the epidemiological literature as Neyman bias.
This is a vital concept because it involves the data actively lying to you by omission. Neyman bias occurs when the patients who survive a condition, the ones who manage to stay alive long enough to be captured by your delayed cross-sectional snapshot, are fundamentally atypical compared to the total population that originally developed the disease.
The textbook highlights a profoundly counterintuitive population-based study of Alzheimer's disease conducted in Sweden that perfectly illustrates this phenomenon. When the researchers analyzed their initial cross-sectional snapshot of the elderly population, looking at smoking history and dementia prevalence, the statistics generated a shocking result.
The data suggested that smoking was highly protective against developing Alzheimer's disease. The calculated odds ratio was 0.6.
Which implies that active smokers were 40% less likely to have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's compared to non-smokers. From a purely biological standpoint, given the vascular damage caused by smoking, that makes zero sense.
It makes no sense biologically, but mathematically that is exactly what the snapshot showed. However, the researchers then transitioned their methodology. They turned their static snapshot into a longitudinal moving picture and followed these cohorts over time.
And the longitudinal data completely shattered the illusion.
It did. Smoking offered absolutely no neurological protection. What was actually happening was a phenomenon of competing mortality risks. The individuals who smoked and subsequently developed dementia suffered massive compounding vascular damage.
Meaning they died incredibly rapidly from acute cardiovascular events like massive myocardial infarctions, long before the researchers arrived to take their cross-sectional survey. Their hazard ratio for mortality was a devastating 3.4.
Because they died so quickly, they were erased from the population pool. When the researchers finally took their snapshot, the only people left alive to be counted were the non-smokers with dementia and the smokers who hadn't developed dementia yet.
The sickest smokers were already gone. This creates the powerful statistical illusion that smoking prevents the disease, when in reality, it just accelerates the death of the patient.
If the exposure you are studying drastically alters the survival rate of the disease, your prevalence snapshot will be completely corrupted.
We see a very specific, highly relevant variation of Neyman bias in occupational health research, known as the healthy worker effect.
Oh, yes. The Spanish cross-sectional study investigating occupational asthma.
Exactly. When the researchers looked strictly at the current workforce employed in high-risk chemical environments, the odds ratio for asthma was surprisingly low, only 1.4. It barely looked like a hazardous job.
But when they adjusted their survey to include individuals who had previously worked in that industry but had since left, the odds ratio immediately doubled to 2.8.
Because the workers who developed reactive airways didn't just quietly suffer in the chemical plant. They got sick, they realized the environment was destroying their lungs, and they quit. They migrated to cleaner, safer occupations.
So the only individuals remaining on the factory floor for the researchers to evaluate were the biological outliers, the workers with ironclad lungs who were immune to the chemical irritants.
The current workforce appeared falsely, artificially healthy, because the vulnerable individuals had already self-selected out of the exposure pool.
All of these biases underscore a fundamental truth about epidemiological research. The mathematical validity of your findings is entirely dependent on the structural integrity of your sample. If your sample does not accurately represent the totality of the population, your conclusions are inherently flawed.
Which transitions us perfectly into the practical mechanics of how researchers actually get human beings to participate. Sampling strategy is the physical logistics of epidemiology.
The standard textbooks outline the classic methodologies. Simple, random sampling where everyone has an equal statistical chance of being chosen. Stratified sampling, which forces the inclusion of specific minority demographics so they aren't drowned out. And cluster sampling, which relies on geographic grouping.
But those methods assume you have a master list of the population. How do epidemiologists measure the prevalence of a disease in a population that is actively, intentionally hiding from the authorities?
That requires abandoning probability sampling and moving toward highly specialized convenience sampling techniques, specifically snowball sampling and the more mathematically rigorous respondent-driven sampling, or RDS.
The literature provides a deeply poignant case study from eastern Nepal. Researchers needed to evaluate the prevalence of clinical depression among commercial female sex workers. In the context of Nepal, this occupation is heavily criminalized.
The women face severe societal stigma, routine police harassment, the constant threat of violence. There is no municipal registry, no formal union, no safe geographic cluster. Traditional sampling methods would completely fail.
You can't just utilize random digit dialing to call households and ask someone if they're engaged in criminalized sex work. They will simply hang up the phone. The population is entirely opaque to traditional surveillance.
Exactly. Therefore, the researchers had to map the invisible social network from the inside out. They initiated the study by partnering with a trusted local NGO that provided discrete health services to this community. They used this NGO to identify a small initial handful of participants.
These initial women are called the seeds.
Right. And after completing their face-to-face psychiatric interviews, these seed participants were given coupons and asked to recruit their peers, other women within their hidden underground network.
The methodology leverages the trust inherent in the marginalized community. The second wave of participants only comes forward because they were vouched for by the first wave. The sample physically snowballs outward through the hidden network.
And respondent-driven sampling refines this by mathematically weighting the data based on the size of each participant's personal network, adjusting for individuals who are highly connected versus those who are isolated.
By utilizing this network-based trust, the researchers were able to penetrate the hidden population and uncover a staggering 82% prevalence of clinical depression among these women. This is a massive, critical public health burden that traditional rigid sampling methods would never have discovered.
It's an incredible technique, but, the challenge of participation extends far beyond criminalized or marginalized populations. Epidemiology is currently facing a systemic crisis of apathy.
The historical data shows that participation rates in general population studies have been steadily declining by approximately 1% every single year since 1970.
The general public is increasingly fatigued by surveys, distrustful of data collection, highly protective of their time. We're losing our ability to take an accurate cross-sectional snapshot simply because the subjects are refusing to look at the camera.
So, researchers have had to rigorously study the science of survey compliance itself. What actually compels a modern citizen to fill out a health questionnaire? The textbook cites a monumental systematic review conducted by Edwards and colleagues, which analyzed 292 randomized controlled trials dedicated purely to survey methodology, encompassing over 250,000 individuals.
They wanted to strip away the assumptions and find the empirical evidence for what actually drives response rates.
And the behavioral data they uncovered is highly actionable. If you want high participation, the most effective intervention is an unconditional monetary incentive.
Meaning you do not promise to pay them after they return the survey.
No. You send the cash or the voucher physically attached to the blank questionnaire. The psychology of reciprocity is powerful. People feel a social obligation to complete the task because you already trusted them with the compensation.
Furthermore, response rates rise significantly when the communication clearly originates from a recognized university or academic institution rather than a commercial research firm or a government agency. Academic branding still carries a premium of public trust.
You also must keep the questionnaire brief. Utilize a pre-contact notification letter to establish legitimacy, and use recorded delivery to signal importance. Essentially, respect their time, compensate them upfront, and leverage academic sponsorship.
But getting a subject to participate is only half the battle. The next hurdle is getting them to tell the truth. Human beings are deeply prone to social desirability bias.
We inherently want to present a sanitized, socially acceptable version of ourselves to the interviewer. If a researcher sits down face-to-face with a teenager and asks detailed questions about illicit drug use or stigmatized sexual behaviors, the data will almost certainly reflect a massive undercount.
This psychological barrier dictates that the physical interface of data collection fundamentally alters the quality of the data itself. To combat social desirability bias, researchers developed audio-computer-assisted self-interviewing, or ACASI.
How does that work?
In this methodology, the human interviewer is completely removed from the sensitive portion of the survey. The participant wears headphones, listens to recorded questions, and inputs their answers directly into a secure computer interface. It provides total psychological privacy.
And the impact of removing the human element is statistically astounding. In a study tracking the behaviors of adolescent males, researchers compared traditional paper and pencil surveys administered in a classroom setting against the ACASI methodology.
The difference is night and day.
When using the paper surveys, only 1.5% of the adolescent males reported engaging in male-male sexual contact. However, when the exact same demographic was evaluated using the private ACASI system, the reported prevalence jumped to 5.5%.
Nearly a four-fold increase in the reported prevalence of a highly stigmatized behavior, achieved entirely by altering the interface to eliminate the fear of human judgment.
The evolution of data collection interfaces is moving incredibly rapidly. We're seeing a massive shift toward digital and passive surveillance.
The epidemiological literature outlines the transition to web-based surveys, which are vastly cheaper to deploy, but historically suffer from abysmal response rates unless paired with aggressive incentive structures.
But the true frontier of cross-sectional methodology lies in the devices we carry every day. Smartphone technology allows for real-time, continuous, ecological, momentary assessment. Our phones function as perpetual cross-sectional sensors.
Consider a study conducted in Barcelona where researchers deployed smartphone applications to continuously track the geographic location and the accelerometer-based physical activity of their subjects.
They then overlaid this high-resolution behavioral data onto real-time municipal air pollution maps. They could precisely measure the subject's acute exposure to environmental toxins based on their micro-movements through the city.
Researchers are even mining social media for real-time public health snapshots. One study utilized Twitter architecture, tracking 773 specific tweets containing hashtags like #fruit or #mood, allowing them to map dietary behaviors, emotional states, and psychosocial drivers of food consumption in absolute real time across a massive population.
It represents a paradigm shift in how we capture the prevalence of human behavior. It's a remarkable technological leap. But as we transition our focus from the methodologies of cross-sectional studies to the entirely different framework of population screening, we are making a profound philosophical pivot.
We're moving from the camera to the radar.
Exactly. A cross-sectional survey is fundamentally passive. It describes the burden of disease, but public health inevitably demands action. We want to intervene upstream before the disease manifests. Let's pivot to Chapter 11.4 and establish the absolute definition of screening, because the clinical misuse of this term causes immense confusion.
Screening is the systematic, proactive application of a test or inquiry to a population of individuals who are presumed to be completely healthy and asymptomatic. They have not noticed a lump, they do not have a chronic cough, they have not walked into your clinic seeking medical attention.
That distinction is paramount. This is fundamentally different from opportunistic testing or clinical case finding. If a patient with a known diagnosis of chronic hypertension is sitting in your consultation room and you decide to order a lipid panel or check their renal function, you're not screening them.
No, you are managing an existing patient.
Right. Population screening involves designing an industrial-scale program to proactively invite tens of thousands of citizens, people who are currently feeling perfectly well, to undergo a medical procedure to look for a hidden pathology they have absolutely no reason to suspect they harbor.
And because of the proactive nature of that invitation, population screening carries a massive, unique ethical burden. As the pioneering epidemiologists Cochrane and Holland articulated decades ago, the ethical paradigm of screening is entirely distinct from standard clinical practice.
In standard practice, a sick patient seeks out a physician for relief.
Yes, the physician offers a treatment, and both parties understand there are inherent risks and side effects. The patient accepts that risk in exchange for the potential cure. But in population screening, the healthcare state is the initiator.
When a government health agency mails a letter to a healthy citizen, strongly advising them to undergo a mammogram or a colonoscopy, the state is making an implicit, almost sacred promise.
The state is promising that by participating in this program, the individual's life will be demonstrably improved, and that the intervention will undoubtedly cause more good than harm.
And keeping that ethical promise is mathematically brutal. We have to dive into the statistical reality of the radar system. To understand why screening programs so frequently generate controversy, you have to understand the fundamental test properties. Sensitivity versus specificity.
And this is where the deeply ingrained instincts of a practicing clinician clash violently with the cold mathematics of population epidemiology.
Clinicians are terrified of missing something.
Absolutely. If we look at the clinical mindset, a physician working a busy shift in an emergency department is perpetually terrified of the false negative. They are terrified of missing a subtle myocardial infarction or a hidden malignancy and sending a dying patient home. Therefore, the clinician prioritizes sensitivity.
Sensitivity is the ability of a test to correctly identify every single individual who truly has the disease.
The clinician wants a highly sensitive test that casts a wide net, ensuring no true positive slips through the cracks.
But when you scale a test up to the population level, the mathematical dynamics completely invert. In a national screening program, you are deploying this test across millions of people where the baseline prevalence of the target disease is usually incredibly low, frequently less than 1%.
In that massive, low-prevalence environment, specificity becomes the supreme overriding metric. Specificity is the ability of the test to correctly identify the healthy people and definitively rule them out.
Let's run a hypothetical scenario to demonstrate why high specificity is the only thing standing between a public health program and total systemic collapse.
Okay, let's evaluate a metric called the positive predictive value, or PPV. The PPV is the only number the patient actually cares about. It answers the question, "Doctor, my screening test came back positive. What is the actual mathematical probability that I genuinely have this terrifying disease?"
Let's build a model. Imagine a rare but serious condition that has a baseline prevalence in the general population of 0.1%. This means that out of a completely random sample of 10,000 citizens, only 10 individuals actually harbor the hidden disease. 9,990 individuals are perfectly healthy.
All right, 10 sick, 990 healthy.
Now imagine a biotech company pitches you a new screening test. They boast that it has 95% sensitivity and 95% specificity. To a layperson, a test that is 95% accurate sounds phenomenal.
It sounds phenomenal until you run the population through it. Let's deploy this test on our 10,000 citizens. First, let's look at the 10 individuals who actually have the disease. The test has 95% sensitivity. It works beautifully. It correctly flags 9 of them, and we tragically miss 1. The clinical net caught the true positives.
But now we must process the 9,990 perfectly healthy individuals.
Right. The test has 95% specificity, meaning it correctly identifies 95% of them as healthy and sends them home, but it fails on the remaining 5%. It incorrectly flags 5% of the healthy population as positive. What is 5% of 9,990 healthy people?
It's roughly 500 individuals.
So your early warning radar system just lit up with 509 positive alarms.
9 of those alarms are true positives representing sick patients. 500 of those alarms are completely false, terrifying healthy citizens.
Exactly. So if a patient receives a phone call from your screening clinic telling them their test is positive, their positive predictive value, their actual probability of having the disease, is 9 divided by the total 509 positive results.
That calculates to a positive predictive value of just 1.8%. Think about the immense clinical fallout of that number. You have a test that is marketed as 95% accurate, yet 98 times out of 100 when a patient gets that harrowing phone call telling them their cancer or genetic screening was positive, the test is lying to them. They are entirely healthy.
This is the inescapable mathematical trap of screening in low-prevalence populations. If your specificity is not pushed as close to 100% as biologically possible, the sheer absolute volume of false positives generated by the massive denominator of the healthy population will completely overwhelm the tiny number of true positives.
You'll crash your diagnostic clinics, bankrupt your radiology departments, and inflict mass psychological terror on the public.
The literature provides a very pragmatic, real-world example of mitigating this disaster in the context of screening for the beta thalassemia genetic trait. Historically, programs used a blood metric called mean cell hemoglobin, or MCH.
If administrators set the diagnostic cutoff point very low, they achieved near 100% sensitivity. They never miss a carrier.
But in regions where the prevalence of the genetic trait was low, the specificity plummeted. The positive predictive value dropped to an abysmal 1.3%. This meant massive numbers of healthy individuals were falsely identified as potential carriers, triggering a cascade of what is known as partner recall.
Where spouses are anxiously summoned to the clinic for emergency genetic counseling and blood draws, the human cost of that anxiety is immense.
However, researchers demonstrated that you can salvage the positive predictive value by structuring a multi-stage screening pathway designed entirely to boost specificity. Instead of acting on the MCH alone, they added simple, highly specific secondary filters.
They required clinicians to ask targeted questions about the family's geographic origins, or they utilized a secondary, highly specific blood analysis like HbA2 estimation before sounding the alarm.
By layering these specific filters, one regional program managed to reduce their unnecessary partner recall rate by an astonishing 96% without sacrificing the true positive cases. They engineered the false positives out of the system.
This engineering mentality perfectly transitions us into the economic reality of public health. Because a screening program is never merely a laboratory test. It is a massive, sprawling, highly integrated industrial system.
It requires dedicated IT infrastructure to track and invite citizens, specialized high-throughput laboratories to process the assays, advanced diagnostic clinics to investigate the inevitable false positives, surgical and oncological wards to treat the confirmed true positives, and bureaucratic oversight committees to ensure relentless quality assurance across the entire pipeline.
And every single node in that sprawling industrial pipeline consumes finite resources. It consumes taxpayer money, and more importantly, consumes highly specialized medical manpower.
In the realm of public health economics, we must fiercely evaluate these systems through the lens of opportunity cost. The healthcare budget is a zero-sum game. Every $1 million allocated to fund a sprawling, low-yield population screening program is $1 million, or a measurable quantity of quality-adjusted life years, or QALYs, that is structurally denied to another critical sector of the health system.
Could the vast resources poured into a screening program with a 2% positive predictive value have been far more effectively deployed by hiring hundreds of specialized neonatal nurses or heavily subsidizing highly effective primary prevention campaigns like smoking cessation?
The difficulty of justifying these massive expenditures is compounded by the fact that the economic models are incredibly fragile. They rely on forecasting the behavior of diseases decades into the future. Consider the trajectory of the National Screening Program for Abdominal Aortic Aneurysms, or AAA.
The AAA screening saga is a fascinating lesson in shifting epidemiological baselines. The original rigorous randomized controlled trials that generated the evidence proving that ultrasound screening for AAA effectively reduced mortality were conducted decades ago.
During the era of those initial trials, the baseline prevalence of smoking in the male population was significantly higher. Smoking is a massive primary risk factor for the development of aortic aneurysms. The initial economic models, based on that high prevalence era, demonstrated clear cost effectiveness.
But implementing a national screening infrastructure takes years of political and bureaucratic maneuvering. By the time the government finally rolled the AAA screening program out to the general public, other, entirely separate public health initiatives had succeeded. Massive public health campaigns and taxation had successfully driven the population's smoking rates down dramatically.
Consequently, the underlying baseline prevalence of the disease had plummeted before the screening program even began scanning patients. Because the disease became significantly rarer, the number of scans required to find a single viable aneurysm skyrocketed.
The cost per life saved spiraled upward, rendering the original cost-effectiveness models wildly overly optimistic. The pathological landscape literally shifted beneath the feet of the policymakers, undermining the economic justification for the radar system.
And those purely financial models rarely account for the hidden human toll inflicted by the system. Think back to those 500 perfectly healthy citizens who received false positive results in our mathematical example.
When they receive that terrifying phone call, they take days off from work. They demand rapid, expensive follow-up scans like MRIs or invasive biopsies. They endure sleepless nights and profound psychological distress. That is real, quantifiable economic and psychological damage, and it is being directly inflicted upon a healthy population by the healthcare system itself.
Which forces us to confront the profound ethical complexities of looking too closely at a population. We must remember that screening is not simply a neutral, dispassionate scientific exercise. It is inherently a political and social intervention. When you systematically target specific demographics or search for specific genetic traits, you risk catastrophic stigmatization.
The history of public health offers a deeply sobering case study in how quickly a well-intentioned program can trigger societal damage. The rollout of the 1970 U.S. Sickle Cell Act. The legislation was designed to identify carriers of the sickle cell trait to provide them with early care, genetic counseling, and resources. The intention was protective.
However, it was deployed rapidly, often targeting specific demographic communities without laying the necessary educational groundwork to ensure the public understood the science.
The programmatic failure lay in the communication of the nuance. The general public, the media, and crucially, major employers and insurance companies completely failed to grasp the fundamental biological distinction between suffering from the debilitating sickle cell disease and merely being an asymptomatic, healthy carrier of the sickle cell genetic trait.
Because of this widespread ignorance, healthy carriers were viciously stigmatized. Individuals were unjustly fired from their jobs, denied life insurance policies, and subjected to profound social discrimination. The outcome was that the targeted communities rightfully rebelled, viewing the screening program not as a medical service, but as an instrument of state-sponsored oppression.
They actively refused to be tested, completely destroying the public health initiative. It stands as a grim historical reminder that dropping a complex diagnostic program into a society without massive preemptive public education will inevitably cause immense harm.
This historical failure forces us to critically evaluate the modern concept of informed choice. Every pamphlet for a screening program boldly claims that participation is entirely voluntary and based on informed consent. But how voluntary is it, practically speaking?
If a primary care physician's clinic is financially penalized by the government for failing to hit a 90% compliance target for cervical or breast screening, how much true autonomy does the individual patient actually retain when that physician is heavily pressuring them to comply?
And furthermore, how can a lay patient genuinely provide informed consent when the statistical reality, the complex math of positive predictive values, competing risks, and the highly abstract concept of overdiagnosis is so technically opaque?
It is arguably one of the most profound ethical dilemmas in modern medicine. Can a standard trifold pamphlet mailed to a citizen's home truly convey the paralyzing nuances of lead time bias or the reality of false positives? Frequently, the answer is no.
This communication gap is why authoritative bodies, such as the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, argue for the necessity of the state's stewardship role. They argue that a democratic state must bear the burden of making the complex, utilitarian decisions regarding which programs are safe and efficient to offer at a population level.
Simultaneously, the state must aggressively elevate the baseline medical literacy of the public, ensuring that citizens are making actual choices rather than simply capitulating to the authoritative momentum of the medical establishment.
And as we discuss the ethics of genetic screening, we must acknowledge the dark historical shadow that looms over this specific field. The epidemiological literature explicitly contextualizes modern genetic screening within the grim history of eugenics.
In the early 20th century, eugenics operated as a mainstream, highly destructive social philosophy that ultimately culminated in the atrocities of the Nazi regime, predicated on the monstrous goal of improving human hereditary traits by eliminating the quote-unquote unfit.
As modern medicine advances rapidly into an era characterized by widespread preconception carrier screening and highly accurate non-invasive prenatal testing, we are navigating a landscape fundamentally defined by reproductive choices based on genetic data.
It is imperative to state that modern clinical genetics is anchored in individual autonomy and non-directive counseling, which is the absolute antithesis of coercive state eugenics.
However, the academic literature acknowledges that public anxiety regarding a new eugenics is a highly valid, deeply rooted societal concern. Policymakers designing these screening programs must actively, transparently navigate these fears. The integration of genetic screening into standard prenatal care must meticulously reflect shared societal values and profound ethical consensus, rather than simply advancing because the technological capability exists.
The technology must serve humanity, not dictate its future. This constant tension between technological capability, statistical reality, and human harm brings us to the most fiercely contested, highly emotional battlefield in all of public health: cancer screening.
If you want to comprehend why brilliant, deeply experienced epidemiologists will argue passionately and sometimes bitterly about national cancer screening guidelines, you must master two incredibly deceptive statistical illusions. These are length time bias and lead time bias. Let's begin by dismantling length time bias.
Length time bias is a phenomenon driven entirely by the varied biological behavior of tumors. Let's use an analogy to visualize this. Imagine a population is developing two vastly different types of cancer. We will call the first type a turtle tumor. It is incredibly slow-growing, indolent, and essentially benign. It can sit quietly in the body for 10 or 15 years before it ever causes a symptom or threatens the patient's life.
And we will call the second type a rabbit tumor. It is violently aggressive, mutates rapidly, and can develop from a single cell to a fatal burden within 8 or 10 months.
Now, imagine you implement a national screening program where you scan the population every 3 years. Your early warning radar sweeps the landscape at 36-month intervals.
Because the turtle tumors remain in the detectable preclinical phase for a decade, your 3-year radar sweeps are virtually guaranteed to detect them. You will catch almost every single turtle.
However, the aggressive rabbit tumors move too fast. They develop, become symptomatic, and frequently kill the patient entirely within the 36-month window between your scheduled screening scans. In the literature, these are referred to as interval cancers.
Therefore, the patients who are successfully detected by your screening program are disproportionately, overwhelmingly, the individuals harboring the slow-growing, relatively harmless turtle tumors. The aggressive cancers evade the radar.
Exactly. And here is where the statistical illusion takes hold. When the health department publishes the survival statistics for their screening program, the data looks absolutely miraculous. The patients whose cancer was detected by the screening program have incredible long-term survival rates.
But they're surviving because they biologically possessed the indolent turtle cancer, not because the screening program intervened and saved them from an aggressive disease. The screening program takes credit for the naturally slow biology of the tumors it preferentially catches. That is length time bias. It makes a useless screening program look like a spectacular success.
And then we must confront lead time bias, which is arguably an even more insidious illusion because it distorts a fundamental perception of human mortality.
Lead time bias is a pure mathematical distortion regarding survival time. Let's walk through the timeline of a hypothetical patient to understand the trap. Imagine a 50-year-old woman develops the initial cellular mutations of breast cancer. In a universe without any screening programs, the tumor grows silently for 5 years. At age 55, she feels a physical lump, seeks medical attention, and is formally diagnosed. Tragically, despite aggressive treatment, the cancer is lethal, and she passes away at age 60.
In this scenario, her measured survival time from the point of clinical diagnosis is exactly 5 years. Now let's reset the timeline and introduce a highly sensitive screening program.
The underlying biology of the tumor remains exactly the same. But now she undergoes a routine mammogram at age 52. The highly sensitive radar detects the microscopic anomaly 3 years before she ever would have felt a lump. She is diagnosed at 52, undergoes immediate surgery and chemotherapy, but because the biological trajectory of the specific aggressive tumor cannot be altered by current medical science, she still tragically passes away at age 60.
Look at how the statistics drastically change, even though the patient's actual lifespan did not. In the screening scenario, her official survival time from the point of diagnosis is now calculated from age 52 to age 60. It is an impressive 8-year survival time. The advocates of the screening program will proudly publish data showing that their intervention increased survival time by a massive 3 years.
But the grim reality is that the screening program did not prolong her actual life by a single minute. The date of her death remained completely unchanged. The program merely moved the date of her diagnosis backward in time. It gave her 3 extra years of knowing she had cancer. It subjected her to 3 extra years of profound psychological anxiety and toxic medical interventions without conferring any actual mortality benefit.
That temporal illusion is lead time bias. You didn't extend her life, you merely extended her time as a patient.
And these two profound biases form the epicenter of the intense ongoing debates surrounding specific national cancer screening protocols. Let's examine breast cancer screening. It is a deeply emotive, highly politicized topic. The epidemiological literature, specifically citing rigorous analyses like the Cochrane reviews and the blistering critiques published by researchers such as Peter Gutsche, highlights a severe problem with overdiagnosis.
They argue compellingly that mass mammography screening, particularly when applied to younger, lower-risk age groups, leads to the detection and aggressive surgical treatment of thousands of turtle tumors, cellular abnormalities that would never have progressed to threaten the woman's life.
These women are subjected to the intense trauma of a cancer diagnosis, the physical disfigurement of unnecessary mastectomies, and the physiological hazards of radiation therapy for a disease that was never destined to harm them. Yet, the political and public momentum supporting these programs is virtually unstoppable. As the Oxford text candidly notes, it would be a daring policymaker who would suggest that the scheme should cease.
Then we must analyze cervical cancer screening, which is almost universally heralded as one of the greatest public health triumphs of the 20th century. It undeniably saves lives. However, an objective epidemiological analysis forces us to confront the staggering resource intensity required to achieve that victory.
The literature frequently cites Angela Raffles' comprehensive data analysis from the screening program in Bristol. To successfully prevent just one single death from cervical cancer, the public health infrastructure must continuously screen 1,000 women every few years for an astonishing 35 years.
During that massive, decades-long endeavor, 150 of those healthy women will receive an abnormal, highly terrifying result. 80 of them will be subjected to invasive, uncomfortable diagnostic investigations like colposcopies. 50 of them will undergo physical surgical treatment to their cervix.
All of that immense systemic effort, anxiety, and minor surgical morbidity is expended to save exactly one life. It is highly effective, but the human economic footprint is astronomical. Crucially, as the literature points out, the widespread implementation of the HPV vaccine is entirely revolutionizing this landscape. By vaccinating against the virus that fundamentally causes the cellular mutations, we are shifting the paradigm away from the heavy burden of secondary screening and moving toward the ultimate goal: true primary prevention.
And finally, we have prostate cancer and the PSA test. In epidemiological circles, widespread PSA testing is frequently cited as the absolute poster child for the catastrophic harms of overdiagnosis. Prostate cancer is essentially omnipresent in the elderly male population. As the old, grim medical adage states, many more men die with prostate cancer than of it.
The test is highly sensitive but deeply unspecific, routinely picking up indolent microscopic turtle cancers. The prevailing consensus in the rigorous public health literature is unambiguous. Based on present evidence, there is no justification for the systematic population screening of asymptomatic men utilizing the PSA test.
The massive documented harms inflicted by the cascade of interventions, the infections caused by unnecessary prostate biopsies, and the permanent incontinence and impotence caused by radical prostatectomies vastly outweigh any marginal population-level mortality benefit.
Which logically leads us to a profound operational question. If the epidemiological data clearly demonstrates that a screening program is inflicting systemic harm through massive overdiagnosis, why is it so incredibly difficult to simply stop the program? Why can't the health ministry look at the data, acknowledge the error, and shut the clinics down?
This is the crux of public health governance. The literature introduces a brilliant, deeply tragic sociological concept formulated by Raffel and Gray known as the popularity paradox. Let's talk about what this means.
The popularity paradox is a perverse psychological feedback loop. It states that the more useless a screening program is, meaning the more it overdiagnoses harmless, non-lethal conditions, the more incredibly popular that program becomes with the general public.
It seems entirely contradictory. A failing program becomes beloved.
It does, because of the human experience of the false positive. Imagine a deeply flawed prostate screening program that detects thousands of tiny, completely harmless, slow-growing cancers. The physicians, acting on the positive tests, aggressively treat those thousands of men with surgery and radiation. Years later, those thousands of men are still alive.
They survived because the cancer was essentially benign and was never going to kill them in the first place.
But those men do not know that. They genuinely, deeply believe that the screening program reached down and snatched them from the jaws of death. They believe the screening saved their lives. Consequently, they become fiercely loyal, highly emotional, incredibly vocal advocates for the program. They start powerful charities, they lobby politicians, they tell their terrifying, triumphant survival stories to the media.
The very evidence of the program's massive failure, the sheer volume of overdiagnosed, overtreated patients, literally manufactures a mobilized, politically untouchable army of survivors who will fight to the bitter end to protect the program from being shut down by the epidemiologists.
It is an almost inescapable psychological trap. The worse the test performs, the more heroes it creates. But the literature does offer one shining historical counterexample of a public health system successfully escaping this trap. It is the story of the Japanese child neuroblastoma screening program.
This specific case study is a masterclass in political courage and evidence-based governance. In 1985, Japan boldly implemented a nationwide screening program targeting infants at 6 months of age looking for neuroblastoma, a type of sympathetic nervous system cancer. They screened millions of infants by analyzing their urine for a specific biomarker called VMA.
Initially, the program appeared to be a massive success. They were detecting and surgically removing thousands of tumors from infants. However, by 1990, highly astute researchers began to notice a terrifying discrepancy in the macro data. The incidence of neuroblastoma diagnoses was skyrocketing, but the overall national mortality rate from the disease was not dropping at all. It remained entirely flat.
They were caught in a massive wave of length-time bias and overdiagnosis. They were detecting unique infantile tumors that possessed the remarkable biological ability to spontaneously regress and disappear on their own without any treatment.
Exactly. The program was subjecting thousands of perfectly healthy infants to the severe risks of general anesthesia, major abdominal surgery, and chemotherapy for tumors that would have simply vanished. An international panel of epidemiologists reviewed the data and forcefully concluded the program was actively harming children.
But unlike so many other programs caught in the popularity paradox, the Japanese government acted. Because Japan had established a strong, independent national evaluation committee insulated from immediate political pressure, and crucially, because the Japanese medical media supported the cold, hard scientific consensus rather than sensationalizing individual emotional anecdotes, the government was able to act decisively.
They navigated the massive public relations challenge and successfully shut the entire nationwide screening program down in 2004. It demonstrates that with rigorous data, clear communication, and immense political courage, the bureaucratic train can indeed be stopped.
And that profound lesson in governance brings us to the conclusion of our analysis of the Oxford texts. But as always, we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on. A concept that builds upon these classical foundations and projects them into the reality of modern practice. We are currently living in an era dominated by wearable technology.
Millions of people are walking around with smartwatches, continuous glucose monitors, and biometric rings.
We are essentially strapping a perpetual, highly personalized cross-sectional study and a 247 population screening radar directly onto our wrists. If the grand, agonizing lesson of public health screening is that applying highly sensitive tests to low prevalence, asymptomatic populations inevitably creates massive false positives, overwhelming systemic anxiety, and the immense harms of overdiagnosis, what happens when we relentlessly apply that exact same logic to the individual every single second of every single day?
Are we utilizing this incredible technology to engineer a utopian future of ultimate, precise upstream prevention? Or by constantly pinging our own internal radars, are we accidentally manufacturing an entirely new, insidious public health crisis? The chronic, paralyzing anxiety of the almost patient.
It is a profound paradigm shift. Reconciling the constant stream of biometric data with the epidemiological realities of false positives and overdiagnosis is arguably the most vital challenge the next generation of clinicians and public health policymakers will have to solve. Right, it is time to shift gears and test your pattern recognition. We're going to execute our rapid single best answer recall prompts based on the frameworks we built today. I will read a clinical or epidemiological scenario, pause briefly for you to formulate the answer, and then provide the resolution. Let's lock this knowledge in. Prompt 1. You are reviewing an observational study that appears to drastically overestimate the protective effect of a specific dietary variable. Upon closer inspection, you realize that the subjects, who both had the disease and were exposed to the variable, suffered massive, rapid mortality, dying before the researchers could enroll them in the study. What is the formal epidemiological terms for this statistical illusion?
Answer. This is incidence prevalence bias, classically referred to as Neyman bias.
Prompt 2. You are reading a historical occupational health study comparing the cardiovascular fitness of sedentary office workers to highly active construction workers. The researchers conclude that construction work prevents heart disease. However, critics argue that leaner, inherently healthier individuals naturally sought out the physically demanding construction jobs in the first place. What specific form of bias are the critics highlighting?
Answer. This is reverse causation, specifically manifesting as self-selection bias. The underlying health dictated the exposure rather than the exposure dictating the health.
Prompt 3. A health ministry is designing a new national screening program targeting a rare genetic marker with an estimated population prevalence of only 0.1%. To prevent the collapse of their diagnostic clinics under a tidal wave of false alarms, which specific test property must the epidemiologists prioritize and maximize above all others?
Answer. Specificity. In extremely low prevalence environments, maintaining near-perfect specificity is absolutely crucial to preserve a workable positive predictive value and minimize the sheer volume of false positive results.
Prompt 4. A highly publicized new cancer screening program demonstrates data showing significantly improved survival times from the date of diagnosis. However, long-term mortality tracking reveals that the program merely detects the microscopic cancer earlier without actually altering or delaying the patient's ultimate biological time of death. What is this specific statistical illusion called?
Answer. Lead time bias. The screening program merely extended the duration the patient lived knowing they had the disease, creating an artificial increase in survival time.
Prompt 5. A global public health initiative decides to track the shifting prevalence of adolescent respiratory conditions. Rather than tracking the same individuals for decades, they conduct a highly detailed cross-sectional survey on a representative sample of 14-year-olds in a specific city. 5 years later, they return to the exact same city and conduct the identical cross-sectional survey on a new batch of 14-year-olds. What specific hybrid epidemiological study design is this?
Answer. This is a panel study. It utilizes sequential cross-sectional snapshots of a specific population parameter to detect trends over time.
Excellent work working through those frameworks. Remember, the true practice of public health is never just about blindly absorbing the statistical outputs. It is about relentlessly interrogating the architecture of how those numbers were built in the first place. Keep looking for the hidden biases, the systemic traps, and the biological mechanisms driving the data.
Thank you so much for joining us on this massive exploration.
Use this discussion as the foundation for your active reading. Keep questioning the narrative behind the numbers, and we will see you back here for the next deep dive. Here are the details of this episode.
Cross-Sectional Studies. Byline. A snapshot of health measuring prevalence in a single moment.